In this movie, I will show you how to set up the render layers I use to aid in compositing, how to set up your final render settings, and as well as how to use and adjust these render layers in After Effects. I'm here in the exercise file 0310 start. So now for the render layers. Let's go to our channel box layer editor, and we'll come out here in our perspective view. And I want to create a beauty layer for everything that we had to start with. Our grapes all textured, our lights, our indirect lighting, our stem, and our stage that we have. So let's just marquee drag everything in the scene. And I'm also going to hold down Shift and just drag and grab that IBL node one more time. In the Render Layer tab, I'm going to click on this particular icon that looks like a floor with a ball sitting on it for Create New Layer and Assign Selected Objects. And we're going to name that from Layer 1 to Beauty. The next layer we're going to create is called an ambient occlusion layer. Ambient occlusion is the phenomenon when objects get close to each other, indirect or bounce light cannot get into those areas or crevices, and the objects will actually begin to self-shadow themselves. For this particular layer, all we need are the pieces of geometry in our scene. We don't need lights or we don't need the IBL node. So we'll just select our geometry and come over and create a new layer. We'll select that layer and we'll see everything else will go away. I'm going to double click on the word layer 1 and name it AO for ambient occlusion. Now to create this as an override for the entire layer, what we're going to do is right click on the AO layer and hold down and drop down to overrides, create a new material override, and we're going to choose a surface shader. Since we're using an override, this will automatically apply it to this layer and to everything in the layer. Our beauty layer will be fine if we come back. All of our shaders are reapplied in the correct places in this layer, and then we're back to our surface shader. Now we can't use a surface shader just by itself, so I'm going to select one object and find our surface shader and rename this AO Material. I'm then going to go to the Out Color and choose Create Render Node. We actually need to find a mental ray texture that will generate this ambient occlusion effect for us. Under the mental ray tab for textures, we're going to come over to the MIB AMB occlusion, and we're going to assign that. Now before we render, we do need to make one change. In the ambient occlusion texture node, the max distance is set to 0. With the max distance set to 0, that means mental ray will choose the distance that it thinks that you need to use. It may be correct. Typically, it ends up being wrong. So I like to at least put something in there, knowing that I will probably have to make changes to that later. I'll change that to a max distance of 1. We'll bring up our render view, save our previous render, and just do a test. And the render's done. You can see it's a very fast render. But you can see where the grapes and the stems are close together. We're starting to get a shadowing effect. This is the ambient occlusion. Also with the grapes and the ground plane. As the grapes get close to that ground plane, they begin to self-shadow themselves. Now, I want it to go just a little bit further. You are going to want this to be a very, very light render pass. But I do want those shadows to go a little further than they are now. And that's done by using the max distance. Let's change that from a 1 to a 5. Save this and do another render layer. Now that we're done, we can see that the shadows have gotten a lot further. And this is probably just a little bit too much. So we'll go back and try a 3. We'll save that and do another test render. Luckily, these render really quickly. So now we actually have a nice ambient occlusion layer. The one thing, similarly to our area light, our shadows are just a little bit noisy. So to get rid of that, under the ambient occlusion node in samples, we can change that from 16 to 48. We really won't see too much of a render hit here, but it will give us much cleaner shadows. And now we're done. So our ambient occlusion layer is complete. We need one more layer, and I like to create this for our grapes, especially for the bloom. The diffuse in the subsurface scattering shader is nice, but just doesn't give us a lot of control. So I have it very, very low at this point, but I do want to create just an extra shader and render layer so that I have the control in the composite to either bring it up or bring it down more if I need. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our beauty node. We're going to come down here to our beauty layer, right click, and duplicate layer. We're going to change the name from beauty 1 to bloom. Now, what I'm going to do is I don't want the floor or the IBL node to be involved. And I also don't want the stems to show up, but I need them to cut themselves out of the render itself so that we have an alpha channel of just the grapes with the bloom. So we're first going to start with the grapes. I'm going to select each one of these grapes, and we're going to assign a new material. And we're just going to use a Lambert. We'll scroll over in the attribute editor till we find our new Lambert, and we're going to call this the bloom material. In the color for our Lambert, I'm going to create a file texture, and we're going to choose the grape diffuse TIFF. I'm going to select our stems, and I'm going to select our ground plane, and I'm going to right click on them, and we're going to assign another new material. And we're just going to choose another Lambert. This Lambert, we're going to change its name to black hole. And we can leave everything else alone under the common material attributes and go to the matte opacity for that black hole shader and change the matte opacity mode from opacity gain to black hole. And that will do it. Let's go back to our main camera, bring up our render view, and do a test render. And there we have it, just the bloom. Actually very similar to an alpha matte. If we come in and just look at the alpha, well, our grapes are the only thing in here that are visible. And this will actually give us a lot of control in our composite. The last thing we need to do is set up our final render settings. And to do that, we'll start in our Common tab. And we will click Apply Output Transform to Renderer and change our output transform to sRGB. We'll change our file name to grape underscore, and we want to pull the render layer names. We'll do that by using a render token by right-clicking in the file prefix name area and choose render layer. Our image format, we will choose TIFF uncompressed. You can either render at home a single frame by using name.extension, or I have a 124 frame camera move, and we would need to use name.number.extension. We'll change our frame padding to 4 and our in frame under the frame range to 124. Keep scrolling down under the Common tab to Renderable Cameras and change that to Main Camera and choose the image size that you want to use. I'm going to choose HD 720. Under the Quality tab, we're going to change the overall quality to 0.7. I'm also going to scroll down to Legacy Options to the Final Gather and change our final gathering from an accuracy of 100 should be okay, a point density of 1, and our point interpolation set to 50. Under Scene, I'm going to go to Data Type and change RGBA half 4x16-bit to RGBA short 14x16-bit. This will ensure that we get a 16-bit TIFF image when we render these out using batch render. And that's it. We're now ready to render this out. Now, to send this to batch render, all you have to do is go to Render, Batch Render, and open up the dialog box. Honestly, the default settings on this, I use them every single time whenever I batch render, so there's nothing here to change. And you can click Batch Render. Now, I do want to show you how to composite this back together in After Effects. So let's hop over to After Effects and take a look. I went ahead and pre-rendered these. So here we are in After Effects, and we have our grapes, beauty, our bloom, and our ambient occlusion already imported into our project. I'm going to start with our grapes, beauty, and drag them down into our composite. Next, I'm going to take the AO and drag it on top of our grapes, beauty. This is how you use an ambient occlusion, is you actually want to change its blending mode to multiply. So with that selected, I'm going to go to mode and change it from normal to multiply. And if we zoom in, we can actually start to see what it's doing when we turn it on and off. It'll actually just add the shadow between these grapes and up here in the stem and just allow those objects to look like they're really either touching or very close to each other. The last layer that we have is our bloom. So I'm going to drag that on top of everything. And this one, we kind of want to see what's going to give us the best effect. Now, we don't want that black that we're seeing in there, so we definitely want to use some sort of blending mode. The blending mode that I would suggest would be a screen. So the screen will take that black out and just give us the white going all the way around the grapes. Now, to lessen this effect, I don't really want that much bloom on our grapes. All we have to do is change the transparency of that particular layer. So we can twirl this particular layer down and go to the transforms and go to opacity and use the slider here to pick how much we actually want. You can just find kind of what you're looking for. Somewhere around in here in the 20% is what I like. Now, the last thing you can do is add an adjustment layer and start playing with your levels, which is typically what you're going to want to do with anything. Almost all files rendered out of Maya will always need some sort of color correction and adjustment in its brightness and darkness values. So to do that over everything, what we're going to do is go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. An adjustment layer will allow you to put an effect and have it affect everything beneath it so that I don't have to individually go through and apply your color correction. We'll come over to Effects and Presets, go to Color Corrections, and find Levels. I'm going to drag the levels onto our adjustment layer, and then just come in here and kind of crunch these down a little bit. Now, color correction is something you could play with pretty much all day long, and is not something in the scope of this particular lesson. So I'm just going to give you a very quick example of what it looks like on and off. And you can actually make things really pop off the screen by changing just the midtones, the brightness and darkness values. Well, there you have it. We have successfully broke down an advanced material into its basic parts, adjusted each area individually, and then built each area back together again in order to achieve our final look. I hope this deep dive enhanced your understanding of subsurface scattering and controlling multiple materials in your projects.